Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the Politics of You and Me. You are joined here by your host, Mpho Nyamathe. I am an intersectional activist, and ever since going to the Green Summit in 2022 and being able to talk about climate change with more than 150 delegates coming from different countries, this encouraged me now more than ever to localize the problems that we experience in our country. I've also been embarking on a journey of advocacy as well as youth development in my capacity as a youth program associate at the South African Institute of International Affairs. This is where we work with young people and increase their voice in policy making, in decision making, be it gender equality, climate action, digital inclusion, all the above. I'm also now someone who's going to be going to Oxford, and that's something so exciting. I'll be completing my Master's of Philosophy in International Relations, and that is such a wonderful journey that I'm happy to be taking with all of you. I'm also a Common Futures Conversations Fellow under the Chatham House program, and this is where young people just get to talk about policy solutions for an array of societal issues that we see. And I come here as your host, as someone who is incredibly passionate about inclusive development. I believe truly that we cannot address the problems that we have in our society in isolation. Everything is connected. And with that, I just want to give a background of my purpose with regards to this podcast. And what I want to do with this platform, what I have been doing with this platform, is to show that politics is ingrained in every aspect of our lives, from the digital divide to gender inequality, from the environmental injustice to the education crisis. Every issue shapes the way we live, work, and exist. And with me as your host, we will be unpacking the lived realities of South Africans, amplifying voices that are often left unheard. This is a hub to engage and challenge while learning about current affairs in South Africa and beyond, guided by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as per Agenda 2030. This is a platform to generate impact through dialogue. Now, to recap some of the topics that we were talking about last week. Last week was centered on digital inclusion. And basically in this episode, my first episode, I was giving an insightful background to the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And this was specifically centered on a really incredible book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, A Sociological Critique. This was edited by senior lecturer at the Sociology Department at the University of Johannesburg, Dr. Trevor Ngwane, as well as Malehoko Twedi, who is the head of the Sociology Department at the University of Johannesburg. This is such a wonderful book that allowed me to break down the Fourth Industrial Revolution in accordance to each stage from the first, second, third, and fourth. And in that, we learned that with every stage of industrialization, more and more people are getting left behind. The first Industrial Revolution was about transport, the steam engines. Yet, it was a large driver, right, for the mining sector. It was a large driver for spatial divides, where people had to travel huge distances from the townships into the cities so that they could make a living, right? And today, South Africans have limited access to transport. The transport that they ideally use is very unsafe, especially for queer individuals, especially for women who actually experience so many sexual attacks on the daily. When we look at our second industrial revolution, which was centered on electricity generation, I really dug into how important electricity is for our well-being, but also for the safety of women, right? Already women in this country experience so much violence, gender-based violence. And the problems of safety in our country are also a problem. We addressed how dangerous it can be for women also not being able to feel safe with the assistance of lighting in their streets, in their homes, on their way home, right? And today we see that so many people do not have electricity, much so concentrated in marginalized areas, right? In marginalized areas where they are so far away in terms of being in rural areas that there isn't great bandwidth for connection, right? And the lack of access to electricity is a problem that also limits economic opportunities, right? We are not being as productive as we can as society because so many people, Black women especially, who could benefit from industrialization, who could benefit from the digital economy, do not have access to that because of the systemic inequalities that we have, right? Most of which stemming from the apartheid era. And when we're looking at the third, and might as well jumping into the fourth industrial revolution, this is centered more on data connection, and with the fourth industrial revolution, these are our advanced tools, right? Our robotics, our autonomous driving, right? Our nanotechnology. But when we look at the reality of South Africans, so many people do not have access to data, to affordable data. It is something that is inaccessible for many. During COVID, so many students were struggling. And not only did first years at the time have to now get to understand how the university systems works in terms of the language, the structure of lectures, but they also now had to work by themselves at home and had a greater demand for computers and technologies and all of that, right? So in last week's episode, we looked at all of that, and we looked at, how people are being left behind, where the gaps are, and how we can bridge those gaps, right? So in terms of looking at solutions, as per the slogan, bold conversations, real solutions, we looked at G20 as well, right? And how the G20 presidency allows us to leverage our position on the global stage and really fast track policy gaps, right? Whether it's sponsoring initiatives or even making them, bigger in terms of initiatives such as She Codes or Tech for Women, whether we can think about how we rethink education in the face of 4IR. How do we make it that 4IR is a tool to ensuring that more young people can read while getting to know digital skills? And we also talked about how G20, in terms of addressing policy gaps, can allow us to also address the problems of a lack of bandwidth in rural areas. So these are the kinds of conversations that we have here on this platform. We have conversations that inspire change, conversations that look at historical factors that form where we are today as a society. And with that, I would like to introduce this week's topic: the practice of environmental injustice in South African mines. Now, in terms of our approach, we're going to be looking at two key pillars of research, right? We're going to be looking at a journal article that was published by, or rather authored by, Jacqueline Koch, and it is titled "Resistance to Coal Inequalities and Possibilities of a Just Transition in South Africa." It was published by the Taylor and Francis Group in the Development Southern Africa Journal. This is a reference from the year 2019. Now, in terms of this research and how we're going to be digging into it, the author really gives an extensive background of coal and how South Africa's mineral energy complex has really informed the country's reliance on coal, right? And with that, we're just going to be digging into it, right? We all know that coal is a key resource, especially in the context of electricity generation. Coal provides about 90% of our electricity, and it's a major source of foreign exchange and of employment, right? Especially with respect to some of the reflections of our author, right? Looking at how we have about 2,500 operating miles, mines, 6,000 ownerless and abandoned mines, and about 1,500 coal trucks on the road to Eskom every day. It is really clear that coal is important to our economy, right? However, even within this conversation, it has allowed us to overlook just how detrimental coal and mining activities have been for communities that are living in close proximity within these mines. These communities, they give up their land, they are not consulted when mines are being established in the regions. Their livelihoods suffer and they experience severe health effects, right? And this is such a great resource for just understanding all of those impacts, right? And the affected parties as well. With this, we're going to be looking at the disproportionate burden that is faced by marginalized populations, right? They experience so many issues. And even within this conversation, as we talk about a just transition, we need to make sure that it doesn't come at the expense of our workers, right? When looking at the closure of Hydrina as a mine, it's also important to note that 2,300 contract workers were unaccounted for in the closure of that unit, right? And the problem with that then is they were contracted, they were hired by labor brokers, these coal miners. And as a result, there was no responsibility taken for these individuals who had lost their jobs, right? And with that, it's just really important then to consider, what does this mean in the face of climate adaptation, mitigation, and finance strategies? What does it mean that in the face of decommissioning coal, we now have to employ privatized renewable energy sources that often leave our workers behind? And that is not just all of the issues. Another one of the issues are the health impacts, right? Whereby, specifically in this research, our author was looking at how many health impacts there are, with about 2,000 deaths a year and 9,533 cases of chronic bronchitis in children aged 6 to 12 and 2,781 cases of chronic bronchitis in adults in Mpumalanga. We can clearly see that the environmental injustice experienced by people in mining affected areas hits so hard on food insecurity. It affects nutrition. It increases vulnerability to illness, particularly in those communities. And then on top of that, it hits the women in those places. And this is where we go back to the concept of intersectionality, right? Being that you already experience certain inequalities from being a Black individual, right? Those are ingrained in our institutions and our society and have yet to be addressed. Now, being a Black woman, that inequality triples, and it further increases your scope of inequality and discrimination and injustice when you come from an impoverished background. Now, with that, consider the realities of women who also now have to act as caretakers for people who are experiencing so many illnesses in the Mpumalanga region. Consider the women who have to work harder to produce crops in those regions, because what happens is, because of the air pollution that comes from the mines, it is now difficult to obtain fruits and crops and all of those things from the soil. The soil has now become infertile. And this is a huge problem because food inflation. I mean, just recently our VAT was announced to increase to 16%. If people are not able to use food gardens as a key resource for eating and taking care of themselves, how will they mitigate the economic changes that often leave underserved communities and those struggling with generational poverty behind, right? And then our second resource that we also are looking at with consideration to this discussion is a journal article written by Busisiwe Kamoleni Khadima and Thandeka Kati. It is titled the MpumalangaHighveld Air Pollution Crisis, right? And it is a South African reparations framework for environmental, state, corporate harm, and it is now published under the Journal for Crime, Justice, and Social Democracy. If I was to just summarize this paper specifically looks at, the historical context of coal mining. Coal mining worked and thrived at the expense of cheap black labor. It thrived at the state at which we were in terms of apartheid. Workers, black workers, were often selected to be mine workers. And because of the political situation during apartheid, these miners, they did not really have a say as to having working conditions that are fair to them, right? And then on top of that, they had poor living conditions as well. And that often resulted in having to move with their families and live in these cramped spaces, or in other instances, living far away from their families so that they can make a living, right? And with that, it's also just important to realize, in terms of our history, certain resources were really sectioned off for white people who were viewed as superior at that time. Now, the problem is the ESCOM, the Electricity Supply Commission, was really tailored to supply electricity to white individuals. If anything, electricity supply rather expanded in the face of industry, in the face of the mine industry and what it could do for the South African economy, but never for the livelihoods of the black majority who needed it for the day-to-day, right? And now when we look at some of the contemporary inequalities, it all feeds back to the history, right? What's happening today is a stark reflection of where we come from and how much we have yet to do. I mean, for example, when we're looking at the Marikana Massacre, 34 people were killed, right? And these were mine workers who were merely demanding an increase in their wages that ultimately accounts for the dangerous work that they do, especially as people who do functions like mine drilling, right? Very dangerous, but super underpaid. And instead of being considered as a labor dispute, right, by, a mining industry, specifically in the Northwest region in Marikana, it was considered as criminal activity, and it led to the gunning down of so many breadwinners who constantly faced unfair working conditions, and at the moment in which they speak up against those, they were met with resistance, right? And that's how we see exactly how much work we need to do, because there still is so much that needs to be changed in our country with regards to how we treat our workers, how we treat our miners, and specifically the people living within those communities, right? And it's also important to acknowledge as well where some of our contemporary failures reside within our country, right? As per the Air Quality Act number 39 of 2004, it is incredibly crucial for us to rehabilitate our mining areas, right? And with that, it is important that if an area exceeds the minimum emission standards of air pollution, then there should be actions to mitigate these high emissions. That's what it says in section 18, subsection 1 of the Air Quality Act, right? Yet we have seen so many cases that do not really hold our leaders to account, and that do not hold our corporations to account with regards to that, right? I mean, for example, when we're looking at the Highveld region, the Highveld region is a priority area because the emissions there are incredibly high. The people living close to that region are struggling, whether it's health, whether it's the environment, and all of those factors accumulating, right? But nonetheless, not only has there been a failure in terms of reducing those emissions, but corporations are not held to account. Your SASL, your ESCOM, they're not held to account. If anything, there has been a record, a history of leniencies being given to these organizations where we as a country have an obligation to stick to our nationally determined contributions as per the Paris Agreement under the United Nations Framework on Conventions for Climate Change, right? And we have our own obligations to make sure that, especially with our emissions, that they're kept to a specific level, right? And that they are restricted for the betterment of our society, but also as a form of international climate action and accountability by individual countries, right? Yet, corporations such as ESCOM, such as SASL, can actually contest. They have the ability and have had a history of contesting emission standards to an extent of the former Minister of Environmental Affairs back when that was still a portfolio, right? Or rather how that portfolio was named, would then allow those leniencies to these corporations to a point where South Africa's emissions standards are now higher than India. They are now higher as well than China, as well as the prescribed limits from the World Health Organization. And that's why it's super important for us to really ensure that there is a sense of hard lines, right? We need to look at the bigger picture as a society, as a country, in ensuring that we keep to emission standards, because already we have so much work to do in terms of capturing and monitoring our emissions. So much of our emissions go overlooked, especially when we consider the burning of waste. This is a nationwide problem, especially when we consider the lack of service delivery coming to underserved communities, township communities, rural communities as well. And as a result, these people don't know where to throw their waste, right? And they now use green spaces, open spaces. Those become waste dumps. And that in turn also affects our air pollution. So air pollution is definitely a huge problem within mining communities, right? But when we look at service delivery and as well as just a lack of accountability to our leaders, that also festers into a bigger issue in terms of how the pollution that really will, play a huge role as well within local communities, within cities that are not necessarily close to mining affected areas, but are also impacted by the way we do things as a country, right? And with that, I just wanted to take us through, a couple of solutions to think about. I mean, the core essence of what we're doing here is to have bold conversations and present real solutions, and often that will encapsulate research, right? And for that, I want to start off by looking at reparations. It's very important for us to consider how we're going to rehabilitate mining areas, right? How are we going to make those into spaces where people feel seen, people feel heard, and people do not have to pay so much in terms of health expenses due to air pollution within mining areas? What are we going to do about the areas that are experiencing acid mine drainage from the mining as well, right? It's important that we think about that, because if there's no conversation about reparations, then our solutions will always be incomplete. We need to do a lot for the communities who have experienced an array of issues. And in that, we also need to consider the workers. We need to consider the workers who are experiencing job insecurity. How are we going to absorb them in the renewable sector, especially when our government is approving independent power producer agreements, right? And this might sound like a great thing, but when looking at the research by Jacqueline Koch and just, some of my own interests as well, I'm just a bit concerned, very concerned actually, about what this means for our workers. It's important that in our conversation about renewable energies, that we make sure that we observe and absorb workers who are constantly left behind. I mean, think about the workers who were contracted during the closure of Hadrina, or rather the closure of several of those units within Hadrina, and just how their livelihoods were shaken by that. It's not enough for us to transition at the world's pace. We need to transition at South Africa's pace. We need to transition in accordance with the issues and the realities of all South Africans, the average South Africans. We cannot no longer have policies that facilitate and assist a certain group of South Africans instead of all South Africans, right? So with that, I really implore our government, but also our communities, to work together with regards to that. We have so many grassroots organizations in the ground, and that brings me to my next point. It is so important now more than ever to have awareness building. Let's take it back to the COVID-19 pandemic. During COVID-19, we were in the middle of a mass campaign. We received text messages. Public spaces were transformed to really, really let us know what it means to stay healthy, wearing a mask, sanitizing, keeping our hands clean, social distancing. These were principles that were even known by young people in elementary school. We need to do the same with all of the issues that we experience in society. We need to really build awareness, greater awareness in terms of what is happening in mining affected communities. The air there is so different. You will be greeted by a thick layer of smog, right? And it's important that we build that awareness. We let people know, just how much air pollution from the mines affects the lungs, how many deaths are connected to it. Because as it stands, air pollution is one of the leading causes of death on the continent. And it's important for us, to raise awareness to that and to really start weeding out the problems, to really start identifying the gaps and the areas of concern as well, right? I mean, just this last weekend, from the 13th to the 15th of March, in my capacity as a youth program associate, I was able to facilitate, lead, and take hold of our Train the Trainers workshop, right? Where we capacitated young people with skills, knowledge, and expertise that allows them to lead air pollution campaigns in their communities. And a big part of that was awareness building, learning about the health impacts of air pollution, learning about the cancel call case and the realities of people living in mining affected areas, putting them in positions to even consider themselves and envision themselves as leaders in parliament and how they would represent their communities and municipalities with regards to air pollution issues. Awareness building is so key, and if it was addressed and applied in terms of all of the societal issues that we experience, awareness on digital inclusion and digital skills, awareness on climate literacy, awareness on mining and the Marikana Massacre, and the ways in which we have yet to rehabilitate mining communities and account and acknowledge the health impacts experienced by people in mining areas. All of that is so important. With that, I think it's also crucial to reform our education system to include conversations about green jobs, and conversations about green jobs that applies to everyone, not necessarily privatized solutions that will only be for the private sector, but solutions as well that really uplifts people who are working in the mining sector, people who are looking to be part of our energy sector. It is important to start having real, tangible conversations about green jobs. What are they? What are green jobs? What do they entail? How can you be someone who is within a green job? How can we take that knowledge to our high schoolers, to our primary school learners? Because that is a huge part of where we are going as a country, as a society, right? And if we're going to be talking transitioning from coal, it is important that we also talk inclusion, that we talk job creation, that we talk economic growth, right? And that we talk education, because education is at the center of anything. With any kind of change that comes in our society, it really needs to seep through education, because our young people, they are our leaders, right? The ones in primary schools, they are tomorrow's leaders, and we need to make sure that they are at the center of these conversations at all times, and that there's being made, a proactive space for them to become leaders in whichever direction they go with how we are developing our society. So I want to thank you all for joining me for yet another episode. This episode was really a huge passion of mine, is a huge passion of mine, and it just brings me great joy to lead this discussion, and it probably won't be the last one. So with this week's topic, the practice of environmental injustice in South African mines, I'm super happy that we could have bold conversations and present real solutions. Catch me next week, where we're going to be talking about yet another impactful conversation that's centered on inclusive development. This is me signing out. Peace and love. Thank you.